up everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we'll be reacting to when F1 failed in America. I'm intrigued, I'm excited to get into this video. I don't really know what I'm getting myself into here. I haven't heard of any like storylines or like news headlines about like F1 failing in America ever before, so I don't know what I'm getting myself into here, but I'm looking forward to getting into it anyway. So I'm just gonna shut up and we'll get straight into it.
America, land of the free, home of the brave, lovers of flags. This country has done some remarkable stuff throughout its sporting history.
I've never seen any other country use as many flags everywhere as America. Like the fact that you guys hang your flag everywhere, like that's just not really a thing that happens in the UK. I don't know if people do that a lot in other countries, but whenever somebody says America, I literally think about how everybody leaves their flag out. I'm like, I don't see any people in the UK doing that. When you drive past their house, there's not a flag just waving about anywhere. I'm like, but you do you, guys. You do you.
And the Yankees ain't one of them. They can make a grand spectacle out of every sport they embrace, and their marketing is second to none, I think. And there is no doubt that in the last couple of years, they have begun to accept the sport of Formula One into their little bubble, with 3 Grand Prix being held in the country, and with a hell of a lot of interest to go with it. With packed out crowds and a push for expansion in the country, everything seems to be going great in the United States of America.
Wow, look at that.
So why the hell didn't it work beforehand? I'll wax lyrical about it today, but despite the reservations you may have toward America's modern day Grand Prix, for them, it used to be worse. Much worse. The first Formula One Grand Prix to be staged in America was in 1959 at Sebring, Florida. Actually, that's a half lie, because from 1950 to 1960, the Indianapolis 500 was incorporated as part of the World Championship. But given it wasn't a Grand Prix as such, we'll deem this 1959 venture as the first one. I know, that is all very interesting information. It was won by Bruce McLaren, who beat Maurice Trentin onto the line by 0.6 of a second. And in doing so, he became the youngest Grand Prix winner ever up to that point. And it would take a long ass time before it would ever be beaten again. And the grandstand finish for the World Championship between Sir Jack Brabham, Sir Sterling Moss, and not Sir Tony Brooks meant it really was a fantastic beginning for the United States Grand Prix. Almost. Because while it was fantastic for the storyline of the Grand Prix circus, the rest of the occasion was almost a literal circus. Firstly, they held the race at Sebring, which is an amazing track, especially for sports car racing, but for the fastest open-wheel cars on the planet, it was about as much fun as being buried alive. But also, despite the high hopes for a race in Florida, the Grand Prix barely attracted half of the crowd that
12-hour Grand Prix
earlier that year. And so, always looking for a profit, the Grand Prix organizer, Alec Ullman, decided to abandon Florida after only 1 Grand Prix and head over to California. Now, this dude was an interesting character, because when they headed for Riverside International Raceway for a second bite at the proverbial cherry, they were banking on the success of a sports car race that summer, which attracted 70,000 people to the venue. And they reasoned that them bringing the best drivers who drove the best cars, built by the best teams in the world, that they would do much better. Well, the problem was, that race he just dissed was sponsored by the Times, the largest newspaper in Los Angeles. And as you would imagine, they decided, nah, we're not going to advertise this race in the lead up. They could just go it alone, and gave them the cold shoulder. Needless to say, attendance was glum, even if the racing turned out to be awesome. And so, as quickly as they came, Formula One would never race here again. 2 United States Grand Prix, 2 different venues, 2 sob stories. Third time's normally the charm. And this time, it actually was. They would end up heading for Watkins Glen International in the state of New York, where it would play host to the United States Grand Prix for 1961, and then 1962, and then 1963, then 64, then 65, then 66. Well, you get the point here. They finally got their foot in the door and attained an enviable level of security in the United States. In 1980, that aforementioned Watkins Glen race fell to freaking pieces. The track was not up to spec to Formula One standards. The sanctioning fees for the race became too much for the organizers, and surprise, surprise, the crowd attendance figures were not so hot either. And so the Grand Prix circus had left Watkins Glen for good. But there was at least something on the Grand Prix calendar for America. There was the race in Long Beach, the imaginatively named called United States Grand Prix West. This ran from 1976 right until 1983, with about as many different track layouts as there were winners of the race. But despite the Grand Prix actually being a success, the costs associated with running the Grand Prix proved to be too much for the organisers and decided not to run Formula 1 anymore, and instead use the Grand Prix as a round of the American Indy Series, which, when you think about it, was an absolutely stupid move if you ignore the fact that the race still goes on today and is one of the hallmark events for the IndyCar Championship, which
I've seen that track before.
Open wheel series in the world. But the omission of Long Beach and Watkins Glen from the calendar did not mean the end for Grand Prix racing in America. In fact, they were just getting warmed up, although not necessarily in a good way, more in a New York Yick's gonna blow a 28-point lead kind of way. Because you see, even if Watkins Glen remained on the F1 calendar that year, it would have no longer been the season finale, because F1 Supremo and Putin dungeon bitch Bernie Ecclestone was looking to expand Formula One's brand in America, and when some folks in Las Vegas signaled that they were interested, Bernie went over to sign the contract and thus secured a spot for Las Vegas on the Formula One calendar for 1981. More importantly, as this season finale. Although, once Watkins Glen bit the dust, this meant there was a little bit more limelight shone onto the Las Vegas race. In theory, more people would flock to this race as opposed to choosing whether to go to Vegas or semi-countryside New York. Yeah, this whole 3 US Grand Prix thing that they're trying to do today, this ain't a new thing. In the early 80s, they were trying to make this a thing. Perhaps ironically, the third Grand Prix out of the bunch being in Las Vegas. Although the glitz and glamour of Formula One, along with the pure opulence of the venue, didn't exactly math out as you would have expected. The track was constructed in a hotel parking lot, specifically the parking lot of the Caesars Palace Hotel and Casino. Thus, instead of being branded as the Las Vegas Grand Prix, it was instead called the Caesars Palace Grand Prix. Formula One fan or not, that name would make anyone shudder. As for the actual circuit, though, there was only so much elevation and space to play with. What we got was a track that was designed using Snake, and with it being in the middle of the Nevada desert in October, it wasn't exactly comfortable for those in the uncovered grandstands. In other words, all of them. While the track itself was actually of decent quality, it had the character of an East German jail cell. It didn't really require much in the way of bravery from the drivers, but the strain put upon their necks, as well as the heat, did destroy them by race's end. Although
I was gonna say
the fact that it was the season finale,
they probably
and that
died.
they had since to play with once that checkered flag had fallen. The enormous paychecks or family backing that they had would be lost to the house thereafter to make this occasion even more miserable than it already was. For some other drivers though, there was a bit more to it than that. In 1981, 3 drivers went into that round with a shot at the world title: Carlos Reutemann, Jacques Lafitte, and Nelson Piquet. After a sort of lukewarm finale to the season, the title battle would be won by Nelson Piquet, and he would celebrate this momentous occasion by saying that the Caesars Palace Grand Prix track was without doubt the worst Formula One track of all time.
What is that?
Year, the venue once again played host to the season finale. However, this time, it was a title battle set between John Watson in the McLaren, who also hated the track, and KK Rosberg in the Williams, who didn't really care as long as he had something to smoke. Watson did his usual number of falling to the back of the field on the first lap, just so he can climb back up it again. He powered through the field and got all the way up to second, but because KK scored 5th in that race, it gave the Finn his first world championship, and actually the only world championship he would ever win. The 1983 race was a particularly interesting affair in that there wasn't one. In fact, it was all turned over to the Indy Series, the same one that took over Long Beach. Although Long Beach's race that year was genuinely of interest, given that it was the final one for Formula One. So within a year, Formula One had lost 2 American Grand Prix, despite their want to push for expansion within the country. However, that did not spell the end of Formula One in America. Far from it. In 1982, the last year
they carried on after that.
An ultimate one for Long Beach, there was a 3rd US Grand Prix on the F1 calendar, held in the Motor City, Motown, Detroit, Michigan.
I believe we built the best cars in the world here, and what better place to have a race than the Motor City?
I don't know, maybe Cleveland?
Come on down to Cleveland town, everyone. Under construction since 1868. It could be worse, though at least we're not Detroit.
That's great.
We're not Detroit.
In theory, Detroit was a really good place for a race. In practice, however, this was about as good an idea as hosting the Super Bowl in the Darien Gap, because right from the start there were problems. Namely, by the time the first practice session was about to start, the circuit wasn't actually finished, which makes the task of racing on it a little bit tricky. Come Friday, the track would finally be done, but only after the sun had dipped below the horizon, which meant that qualifying schedule for that day was cancelled as well. So instead of 4 days of running on a brand new
the race?
They only had 2, they did eventually race on the circuit, and it would soon gain a reputation of being terrible. It was bumpy as all hell, and the narrowness of the circuit in parts made it tricky to pass and easy for mistakes to occur. The attrition on the circuit was manic, so much so that in 1984, out of the 26 cars that started the race, only 5 finished. 5! The track having shaken the car to pieces. Even Ayrton Senna, a dude who won this race 3 times and pretty much got pole position at will, hated the circuit. And in 1988, the city of Detroit hated everyone bad-mouthing their circuit. F1 told them to upgrade the pit facilities. They refused. And so, as a result, the race was culled. And that last race in 1988 saw the track convert itself into a rallycross course throughout the duration of the Grand Prix. That said, it's not as if the city of Detroit should care too much about foreign cars falling apart on their streets. For them, it was a win-win. I guess. There were attempts to shift the race to Belle Isle, where IndyCar would make their home, but these negotiations fell through. In short, the Detroit Grand Prix was not popular with the fans, teams, or drivers. It had a track that was eroded by the wind, it was way too harsh on the machinery, and on top of that, the weather was more often than not terrible for the June date they set it for. That's sad you think that was terrible? Well, there was something worse that happened a few years prior. Back in 1984, Bernie was looking for more gullible American cities to procure money from. Eventually, after scouring the landscape and viewing all options, he decided, yes, Dallas, home of the Cowboys. And already, we are off to a bad start. The city was set within the confines of the Texas World Fairgrounds, and initially, things were looking promising. Ish. Despite it having one too many chicanes. In the main, it was an interesting circuit that was bound to throw up some good racing. In theory, it was committed to a 5-year contract, and as well as that, one of the organisers for this event was the one and only Carroll Shelby. It seems all of this, along with being in a city famed for culture and character, this was a match made in heaven for Formula One in America. Well, the event came along, and by virtue of the fact that this Grand Prix happened only once, you can guess what happened. Now, I used to think that this thing was the worst Formula One track of all time. The critical part of that sentence was used to. Because the more you read into this event, the more this starts to stand out like a dog licking its balls in the sun. See, while the track itself was well received by the drivers, the lack of runoff in some areas was a tad concerning. And that's fair, because, you know, the drivers don't want to die. And it didn't help when the searing heat was causing problems for every living organism in the vicinity. Hell, even the stuff that wasn't alive had enough of the heat. After the Can-Am support race on Saturday, the track was so badly damaged that overnight repairs were required to make the surface even raceable. Never mind up to Formula One standards. There were talks of a boycott amongst the drivers. Considering the initial repairs didn't work and had to be redone in the nick of time for the race, they may have had a point. But there were 90,000 people in those stands. Look at them. Celebrities were literally all around, dying. And Bernie was a dude who, love him or hate him, got things done. Alas, with 30 minutes to go, the track was repaired. Sort of. And the drivers took to the grid to start the race. By the time the Grand Prix was done, cars were spewed all over the track, with 14 of them having crashed into the barriers, not helped with the track breaking beneath them. If the cars weren't destroyed, the drivers were. As with Nigel Mansell fainting in a vain attempt to push his car to the finish. Multiple drivers had a whinge, and despite the organisers' call for the race to be moved to a better date in the spring, Bernie scoffed, canned the Grand Prix, and went off to have another game of poker in an underground club. Of course, terrible surface and scalding temperatures led to the downfall of Detroit as well. Now, does all of this make Dallas the worst F1 track of all time? Honestly, I'm not too sure. All I do know is that video I made way back in the beginning may need some TLC. Of course, Bernie still wants it in on the American market, but with Long Beach gone, Dallas and Detroit no longer having roads
so many attempts
for walking, the Caesars Palace track now taken over by the Mirage Hotel, Riverside on the Death Rattle, Sebring just not being viable surface-wise, and Watkins Glen not in a position to host an F1 race, they were once again looking for a new place to race in America. And eventually, they did find a home in Phoenix, Arizona. Probably not the first place you would think of. Or the second, for that matter, especially given the concerted efforts to race in New York, with a 1983 Grand Prix in Flushing Meadows having fallen through. Not to mention too that Road America is literally there. But hey, it did herald the return of the United States Grand Prix moniker, and thus, Phoenix was given the June slot in the Grand Prix calendar, replacing Detroit.
So, did it work?
Just one problem. In the Northern Hemisphere, June is in the summer, and in the summer, it can get hot. And in Phoenix, Arizona, it can get very hot. Can you see where this is going? And they had set the contract back in mid-January.
Do you even need to explain?
To complete the circuit. It was crazy. And of course, the track began to break up at the end of the back straight. However, unlike Dallas, the quick dry cement actually held up for the remainder of the weekend. But it still wasn't pleasant weather-wise. Surprisingly, F1 actually agreed to shift the date to the season opener in March. Hopefully that would attract more people. I mean, after all, they only attracted a little over 31,000 people for that 89 event. 1990 came by and we had this barnstorming battle between between Ayrton Senna and Jean Alesi, and the 1991 iteration drew much anticipation, given what happened at the end of last year's championship, and that Phoenix had actually redesigned half of the circuit. After 3 years of hosting the race,
so they were actually trying this time.
They will be racing there come 1992. But then 2 months later, he changed his mind, replacing the race instead with Kyalami in South Africa. When they asked Bernie if the attendance figures were not good enough and led to their downfall, he basically replied, "It wasn't that. It's that you couldn't put 20,000 seats in a place where people could actually see racing." Youch, that's painful coming from you, Bernie. And so what this meant was that come 1992, there was no American race on that calendar.
Oh no.
There were talks of a race in San Francisco or Manhattan or even a return to Las Vegas, but there would not be another American race until 2000, when the Grand Prix circus arrived at Indianapolis, where it ran quite well until that fateful day in June 2005.
Oh yeah, I've seen that video.
Racing in America, and 2007 was the last time a race would ever be held there. It seems that the month of June is the kryptonite of American F1.
Yeah.
Who'da thunk? Heading toward 2010, there was again talks of a race in New York. Well,
New York.
A race overlooking the New York skyline is more appropriate. The race would be held in New Jersey, in and around Port Imperial in Weehawken. The plans got relatively far along for what would be known as the Grand Prix of America. But broken promises, a lack of money, as well as Bernie realizing that the track was passing a sewage treatment plant, meant the race would never happen. Other possibilities were also there. A race around Liberty State Park was also discussed, and there was even a possibility that a private country club could land the United States Grand Prix. The track was unbelievably amazing, incredible. But just how serious these discussions were, given it was a private country club, was anyone's guess. Elsewhere, however, plans were afoot for a brand new facility in Austin, Texas. Bernie liked the idea, awarded the race a 10-year deal, and work began on the Circuit of the Americas.
I love that track.
The circuit has played host to the United States Grand Prix, and despite some shaky years, we fast forward to 2022, and it all looks promising. Packed out crowds in Austin, as well as
24 now. It was really good.
And Vegas, with heaps of hype around them. So again, why didn't Formula One work out in America in the past? Well, there were a few reasons. Lack of adequate marketing, rubbish circuits, poor calendar allocation, plans that fell through thanks to investors bailing, a lack of interest among the populace, a perception that all international drivers
quite a few reasons then.
Stuff like that. But all that lay in the past. We are blessed with platforms nowadays where we can appeal to a greater audience in a way not possible before. And when Liberty Media came in a few years ago, they bought the one thing that Bernie just could not get a grasp on for the longest time. Marketing. And with Liberty came initiatives such as the Netflix series Drive to Survive. Now, there is a bit wrong with that show. There is a little bit of bull, but it's preaching the gospel and broadening the appeal of the sport. And
I was going to say, it's brought in so many people to the sport.
To like Formula One almost as much as they like their flags. Although I will say this, ballooning ticket prices beyond reach is kind of asinine. Us peasants are sorely mistreated.
Yeah. Well, that was interesting. The only races there that I knew that they had attempted in America were the one that he did a separate video on, where I think the video was called like the worst F1 race of all time. I saw that one, and then I knew that they had been to Vegas before, but I didn't know how atrocious it actually was. But I didn't know about all the other ones, so that was very interesting to actually see how many times they've attempted to race in the States, and now they've only just finally got a good platform over there. And I mean, like you said there, stuff like Drive to Survive and everything like that has brought in so many other fans into this sport that probably played a big part in, I'd say it probably played a big part in like the US side of like fans coming into the sport. But I mean, it played a part everywhere, but I feel like it had the most impact over in the States. But like I said though, that was a very interesting video, and I know that loads of you have requested that I watch that video. So thank you to the people who requested this video. And with that being said, if you have any other videos that you'd like me to react to, drop them in the comments. I'm working my way through everybody's suggestions at the moment. If you did want to check out any of my other socials or become a Patreon member and get early access to videos like this or top priority of viewer suggestions, then you can do all of that down below. But I hope you enjoyed today's reaction, and I will catch you next time for the next one. Bye.